Good afternoon, all. I wanted to welcome you today to our webinar on two waves of Arab uprising from 2010 to 2022. This webinar is part of our Global Engagement Initiative series. And we hope you join many of our future webinars and events in person here at the Deb Center in New York City as well. Today, we're discussing whether the waves of Arab protests over the last decade have changed anything. What happens now? Our panel of experts will analyze the results of their years of on-the-ground research on political demonstrations in Arab countries that have persisted in different forms since 2010. They will discuss their findings from Lebanon, Iraq, Tunisia, and Morocco. Along with our wonderful representative from the Arab Barometer, we'll talk about waves of regional surveys across the region, focusing on who the protesters are and what their demands are. And I'm going to kick it off with introducing our moderator today, Tania Haddad, the co-director of the Global Engagement Initiative here at the American University of Beirut and assistant professor of public administration. Tania, over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing, as Amanda just said, the two waves of the Arab uprisings from 2010 to 2022. We have with us three experts from the field. First, we're starting with Michael Robbins. He's the director and co-principal investigator of the Arab Barometer. He has been a part of the project since its inception and serving as director since 2014. He has led and overseen more than 100 surveys in international context and is a leading expert in survey methods on ensuring data quality. We have also Dr. Chantal Berman. Chantal is the assistant professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University and an academic scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. Her research investigates the causes and consequences of protest mobilization with a focus on unpacking interactions between states and social movements. We also have Dr. Rima Majed. Rima is an assistant professor of sociology at the Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies Department at the American University of Beirut. Her work focuses on the fields of social movements and uprisings, sectarianism, conflict, and violence. She is currently a research fellow at the Middle East Initiative at Harvard University. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start the discussion with a general introduction. And Michael, my question for you is, based on the work of the Arab Barometer, what are the major trends identified over time and variation by countries?
Thank you so much, Tania. It's great to be here and pleased to share with you some of the data we have on protests across the Middle East and North Africa region over the past decade. So this is based on data from the Arab Barometer, as well as some work I've been doing with Tariq Youssef at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. So to give you a sense about the Arab Barometer, we're a nonpartisan research network. We provide insight into social, political, and economic attitudes and values of citizens across the MENA region. We're the longest standing and largest repository of publicly available data, and we really seek to track attitudes and behaviors of citizens to try and work on building institutional capacity across the region to do surveys and to disseminate knowledge about citizens who live in the region, both within the region and outside of the region. To date, we've done more than 125,000 personal interviews, 87 nationally representative surveys, and done 7 waves across 16 different countries to provide trends on how views have changed over time. And so I'll show you some of that today, and also just note that we are planning a new wave of surveys in the fall in 2023. So later this year, we will be back in the field with releasing a new wave of data next year. So to first of all start with a bit of an overview of protest in MENA. We have data from a number of different waves. The most recent wave was from 2018 to 2019. We actually didn't include this question in the last wave of surveys, in part because of some of the restrictions that were placed after COVID on the freedom of movement and the ability to kind of get together. And so given that, we actually removed it, unfortunately, but I'll talk about the data up until the point that was right before, basically between the main uprisings in 2011 and the second uprisings that happened in really 2018 to 19. So there's a wide range of countries across the Middle East, North Africa. I'll have some data on, particularly focusing on our last wave. There's 11 different countries, a number of different political systems, And these really happened just before the second wave of the Arab uprising. So you can think about in Algeria, we got out of the field 4 days before the Iraq actually started. In a place like Sudan, we were out of the field about 6 weeks before. And again, we were essentially right before some of the major protests had happened. So it gives us kind of a view of where protest was before what really made the news was happening. There was a lot of activity happening before that period. And so that there had really not been the large scale protests that made the news, but as some people like Bobby Parks have noted, there have been something on the thousands and thousands of different protests that have happened in Algeria before the Iraq. So this isn't something that's necessarily new. To give you a sense of the question that we ask, we say here's a set of activities that citizens may take part in. And during the last 3 years, did you participate in a protest, march, or sit in some type of demonstration activity once, more than once, or never? So to give you a sense of this in the last wave, right on the cusp of the second round of major protests, you see that there's wide variation across the region. In Yemen, in a place that has had a lot of challenges, a lot of issues, 40% say they have. In Palestine, another place that there's a lot of this type of activity, 30%. And we see other ranges in Sudan, which underwent major protests, 27%, but it's fairly low in other places. And I would call your attention to the bottom three here, really. In Iraq, there's obviously been a number of protests that did take place with the change with forcing out the prime minister. We see relatively low percentage of people saying they had protested within this period. Same in Tunisia, another place where it may be easier to protest, although Tunisians had actually started to say that it was getting harder and harder to protest. The right was less guaranteed in this period than it had been in previous years. And then in Jordan, another place, a great new book by Julian Schwedler is out, looking at protests in Jordan, and only 7% of people say they have. So there's wide variation that you can see in the level of protest by country in the region. Thinking about some of this in terms of trends, we first asked this question in 2010, 2011. So we started the 2010 wave right before the Arab uprisings in places like Jordan, Palestine. We finished right before. We got to after we were in the field in a number of countries, say in Yemen, when Mubarak fell in Egypt. So it is an interesting wave to think about the level of protest. So you can see in this case, the percentage of people in Yemen who say that they protest has always been quite high. In other places in Palestine, it's gone up slightly, but about 1 in 3 in most of the waves has been protested. And so this is something that is actually fairly common across waves. And a place like Lebanon, it varies between about 15 and 20% of people say in the last 3 years they've taken part in some demonstration. In Iraq, it's relatively flat. And in Jordan, it tends to be relatively low. If we look at North Africa here, you can see that there's somewhat of a similar trend, that in a place like Algeria, you can see that it fell from 17% in 2010. We did this after some of the little bit of uprisings that had happened there, not as large scale, but certainly some protests in 2011. This was done in April of 2011. It kind of fell back to lower levels, and then rises up to about 1 in 5. In other places in Libya, there was a wave of protests there. It falls back in the survey data that we do have. So there is some variation here. In a place like Morocco, it's actually increased slightly. And in Tunisia, it's more or less held steady during this period from the first survey we did there on this in 2013 to the last wave in 2018. So again, some variation across the region. I want to look a bit more at trying to think about who the protesters are. And so I know that this is a bit kind of complicated in terms of running some regression, but we are looking at some of the different things that may lead people to protest and seeing, do we have trends that may hold across the region? And so this may be fairly small on the screen, I apologize, but we do see that there are a number of trends that come through, and we run a number of different models. I won't get into the different specifications here. We do see that those who protest tend to be male, tend to be those who are younger in age overall. So youth tend to be more likely, especially if they're male, they tend to be better educated. They often tend to be, they're less likely to be married, but more likely to be employed. The quintile here is suggesting they're not necessarily likely to come from the bottom income quintiles, those who might be the most aggrieved, have the least to lose. They tend to be people who go to religious services, those who are more likely to say they go to mosque or church. They're also more likely to generally be on social media, to be politically interested. And perhaps this surprisingly, given the fact that many of these countries are actually not democratic, they are more likely to actually have said that they voted in the last election. They're more likely to be a member of an organization. There's a bit of variation here on the sense of some of the grievance hypotheses, that they're upset that the government may not be combating corruption. In some cases, some specification model, they are more upset, in other places they're not. And they tend to be somewhat less likely to trust the government, but not necessarily consistently across the different models. So Again, two of the grievance hypotheses come through, but they don't come through that strongly. But what it does show is that there is really a background of a protester. It tends to be somebody who's younger, better educated, from a higher SES, what we might say has more resources. Also somebody who's engaged, somebody who has a network through either attending religious services, being on social media, being engaged in politics, or a member of organizations. So this fits in with a lot of the literature that we see elsewhere. This is not necessarily people who have nothing to lose turning out to the streets, but people who do have a network, who do have resources and are willing to take part in that, and likely are somewhat aggrieved, have some type of issue with the government, not necessarily looking to overthrow it, but certainly looking to influence it in some way. This shows something similar by breaking up by country. There is some variation by country. I don't want to say that it's not there. Clearly it is, but when we look at it across the board, there tends to be fairly strong findings in a number of these, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A, and I'm sure that Rima and Chantal will have a lot more to say about specific country examples, but it does hold up even if we break this up across different countries. But to give you some sense, kind of the importance of each of these factors, you can see here that these are relatively ranking the factors against one another. And you can see here that the top line is organizational membership, that it's engagement in politics, it's attending religious services, and it's being employed and being male. So again, this just gives you a kind of a broad sense. The higher points on this are those that are more influential in making someone, an individual, more likely to have participated in a protest. Things like corruption and trust in the government are actually relatively weak. It's not as strong as some of these other factors. So again, it does seem to be that there is kind of a general background of the protesters. They are those who have a stake in the game, who have things to lose, and who may be frustrated with the current situation. So let me stop there, and I will turn it over to you, Tania.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Actually, we're going to go back. We have so many questions during the Q&A. I'm going to move to Rima. Rima, quoting from your paper that you shared with us, so revolutions are not supposed to happen in democracies. Democratic governments that have failed to provide for their citizens can be removed through the institutional channels of elections. In nearly 20 democracies ranging from Eastern Europe to Latin America to the Middle East, mass anti-government movements have broken out that embrace the repertoires, the claims-making strategies, and even the vocabulary of revolutions. My question for you is, why did revolutions happen in Lebanon and Iraq, and how they are different from well-studied revolutionary movements in consolidated autocracies?
Great, thank you so much, Tania. I have to say this is work that I've been doing with Chantal Berman here and Killian Clark. So I'll share my screen and start in a minute. Great. So yes, so the cases I'm looking at are Lebanon and Iraq. As Tania said, I can skip the first few slides. This is a conventional wisdom is that revolutions should not occur in democracies because there are other channels. Revolutions are risky. It's very high cost. And usually there should be channels in democracies where, and the literature says even poorly consolidated democracies will tend to diffuse revolutionary waves. However, what we've been seeing in the past decade, and this graph shows it, is a clear increase in the 21st century in revolutions or mass uprisings and regimes that are considered democracies. Iraq and Lebanon clearly fall. There are many other examples. Romania, Bolivia, Nigeria, Guatemala, Chile. We can think of many examples. Specifically, the year 2019 has been a year of global revolt and around the world, specifically in many democracies. The Lebanon and Iraq clearly fall under this category of revolutions and what we can call nominally democratic regimes or kleptocracies. But this also comes in a context of a previous decade of turbulence in these two countries. Lebanon and Iraq have interestingly had waves that are, one could think that they were planned, but they weren't. But exactly the same waves, 2011, 2015, 2018, and then the big outbreak of the uprising in 2019. So it's been a cycle of heightened mobilization and demands that have shifted from reforming the regime to overthrowing the regime altogether. And it's interesting, I think, Michael, some of my findings are actually a bit different. So it would be interesting to look at how our data speak to each other. So the data is based on event catalogs, an archive of protests or a mapping of protests in Lebanon and Iraq. I've done work on different time periods, so I'm happy to talk about earlier periods, namely 2015 in Iraq and Lebanon from the 90s on. So in what follows, I'll try to quickly present some data on who are these protesters, what are they doing? What are they demanding? How are they demanding? So what are their main tactics and how did the state respond? In the case of Lebanon, I have survey data, and I think it's unique data that I've fielded with my colleague Leah Bukhater during the first 10 days of the uprising. And we were actually sampling people from the protest. So not asking them if they went to a protest, but we were sampling from the protest. So here's what we find. So who are these protesters? In the case of Lebanon, it's almost half of the protesters we have sampled, and this is a nationally representative sample, are actually people who had voted just a year before to the main sectarian political parties that they were now mobilizing against, which indicates that a big section of the protesters are actually the constituencies of these traditional sectarian political parties. When we look at their more socioeconomic backgrounds, the data also shows, as Michael has pointed, there's it doesn't show on this graph, but I also find there's a slight majority of males over females. But when we look at their work status, it's interesting that we find that 15% are unemployed, 29% are wage earners, so they are employed, but as we will see in a minute, many of them are underemployed or are employed in precarious situations. 18% are self-employed, which is precarious in this case. What is interesting in this graph is the 1% from the public sector, because the decade preceding the uprising, Lebanon has seen a movement of public sector employees that was quite big and that has mobilized over many years, and was probably one of the most organized movements. Interestingly, these people have not mobilized during the uprising, and of course we can explain this in different ways. One of them is being the clientelistic networks. So these are people who would mobilize for a better pay, but they would not mobilize when it's there's a call to overthrow the regime. So here are just a few other figures from this survey that show us that 68% of the protesters are under the age of 35, so young. 42% of them have only attended public sector education, and 96% never traveled to study abroad. So these are not the well-educated, well-traveled middle-class Lebanese in general. 92% have never traveled to work abroad. The monthly income is relatively low. At that time, before the crisis, it was around a bit less than $1,000, which for that time was low. Most of them said that their average expenditure is higher than their income, which indicates that they rely on debt. And an interesting number from the survey is that 80% of them do not have any kind of medical insurance. And this is interesting because just a few months after the survey, COVID started. So we're talking here about, so this is what precarious labor, not covered by any sort of social security. And generally, even if these are people who, employed, but they, even if they are not the well-educated middle class in general, they still have something to lose, right? So I don't have similar survey in Iraq, but we know from qualitative research that the majority of the mobilizers are also young, unemployed, or underemployed individuals. When we look at organization, and here I think we're defining it a bit different from how you presented it, Michael, but what I find is that the majority of these protests are the participants are unorganized individuals, and unorganized meaning they could be in networks, but they're not organizations per se. So they're not organized in political groups or student groups. In Lebanon, we see a bit more variation where, we see unions, feminist groups, NGOs, etc. In Iraq, there's less of that, at least from the data we have. And the majority is really just atomized individuals who could be, of course, linked together through social network or through social media or other types of networks. But these are not parties or organizations that have a structure and a clear mobilizational power. When we look at what are they demanding, and here it's interesting to look at, and this is what I think the difference we find between democracies and authoritarian regimes. So in both countries, we see demand cycling. So the uprisings go through 4 more main waves. The first one is an escalation where the main demand is the resignation of the prime minister. Of course, there are other demands, many of them socioeconomic, and also interestingly, there's a demand of sustaining the revolution. So there, we see a lot of protests where people are just saying, we want the revolution to go on. But once the prime minister resigns, what we see is a dispersion of the demands. We see an explosion of uprisings mobilizations that are asking for all sorts of different things. And here then we see a period of decline. And here this is the period when the lack of clear organization and clear vision makes it hard to mobilize. There's a resuscitation in both countries, as I will show for Lebanon now, and usually it's around, in Iraq, it was around the Nasiriyah deadline, and in Lebanon, it was around the formation of the new government, and then there's demobilization. And it's important to mention that both of these waves of revolution, Lebanon and Iraq, were very quickly met with COVID, that had put a very abrupt end to street mobilization. So Lebanon, we see the same thing, an escalation until the prime minister resigns, dispersion, fatigue, attrition, and then resuscitation around the announcement of the new cabinet. But then it kind of, there's demobilization and it starts to die out. Why do we see this? The main difference is that it's very difficult in this kind of regimes to determine what success is, unlike in authoritarian regimes where the resignation of the dictator is the end, and signals a transitional period. And those regimes, the resignation of a prime minister does not mean anything. And we see here, this is a photo from Tripoli where this banner reads, "We are continuing to overthrow the president of the republic and the parliament." So power is diffused, and therefore it's harder. It's harder to have to see a clear success. How are they mobilizing? The tactics, I think this is an interesting finding. In both countries, roadblocks in Lebanon more than Iraq, but in both of them we see a high. So the main tactics are the marches and sit-ins in the squares, but also roadblocks, and this is the tactic of the barricade. And in my research, people, when people are asked, why do you block roads, why are you burning tires, they say we want to bring the country to a halt. When I ask what does it mean, they clearly say we don't want anyone to go to work, right? So this here is a banner from Iraq that says "Mako dawam hatta isqat al-nizam," so no work until the fall of the regime. Similarly, in Lebanon, we've seen a lot of banners about the mass strike. So this is a disruptive tactic, unlike the more symbolic tactics of mobilization where you express anger. These are tactics where you actually disrupt, and these tend to be effective tactics that also make the squares possible. So when people block roads, people don't go to work. they end up gathering in the squares. Finally, and of course, I have way more to say about this. I'm wary of time, so we can discuss more details if you want. But finally, I'll look at how the states have responded in both countries. So we see in different trends. In Iraq, the main repression was at the beginning, the first 2 months, and then it declines. And of course, I mean, it's a completely different scale. This is thousands and this is hundreds for Lebanon. But in Iraq, there were many killed and a lot of injured. In Lebanon, we see a high repression at the beginning that dwindles in November, but picks up again in December and January when the decision was made to have a new government, and therefore repression was used to stabilize the political situation and form a new government. What is interesting in both countries is that pseudo-state or parastate repressive actors had an important role, and we have seen them deployed in both countries differently. So it was not necessarily official state actors that were repressing, but it was also these other militias or baltagiya, or call them what you want, that actually played an important role in oppressing the revolutions. And when we look at, so this is actually the only regression I have. So when we look at the probability of death or injury in a protest, it's in both countries. It's high when in Lebanon it's much higher when there's a non-state repressive actor that is mobilized. In Iraq, it's both the military and the non-state actors that are the most repressive. What is interesting in Lebanon is that the military mobilizes way more than the police, but in Iraq, they don't mobilize as much as the police, but they are more dangerous when they do. So I'll stop here. This is just a quick overview, and I'm happy to discuss what this means in terms of outcomes and patterns of protest. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima. Actually, it's really fascinating, the similarities between Iraq and Lebanon. This is something that this is the first time we see it. So we want to continue with whenever we have the Q&A, and the difference between your findings and the one presented by Michael. Chantal, so we've seen like the Lebanon and Iraq, the uprising, but like when we compare it to Tunisia and Morocco, what are the major trends, and how do you see the difference, or are there any similarities with what Rima just presented?
Of course. So thank you so much, Tania, and thank you to Michael and Rima for these really interesting presentations. So as Tania has mentioned, today I'm going to share a few findings from my work on protest activities in Tunisia and Morocco. So departing a little bit from Rima's presentation, this research is really focused on what we might call everyday protests. So protests which are taking place outside of a revolutionary period, protests that are not necessarily expressing anti-regime demands or trying to overthrow the state or transform the political system, although of course they might. So I'm interested through this research, particularly in how citizens are using protest as part of their routine of interaction with the state on different levels, and how they're using protests within these routine periods to secure certain rights or certain resources that might not be available to them through other sort of non-protest channels, even as they might be essential for their livelihoods. And of course, a fundamental question in this line of research is what are protesters asking for, and what are they trying to achieve kind of within this bargaining framework? So again, echoing Rima, I'm going to show you a little bit of evidence from protest event catalogs, and I want to speak briefly to the methodology. So in particular, why are we interested in counting or quantifying protests? What can we learn from this type of work? So the methodology here is quite simple. We are using a given source, in our case, a range of newspapers, to look for coverage of any protest, sit-in, strike. And then for each event, we're collecting a number of information points or variables. Demands, tactics, organizations involved, et cetera. And the result for my team in this project is a pretty large scale database. So covering about 12,000 different protests over this 10-year period. which is 2006 through 2016 in Tunisia and Morocco, and sort of using this data to map some pretty large-scale trends in how people are protesting over time. And of course, to understand some transformations or changes in the nature of protest over this period and between the two cases. So as Michael, I think, had noted in the presentation, we actually do see pretty high levels of protest, even outside of these revolutionary times, which in this data would be represented by the 2011 box. So mapping weekly levels of protests in both cases, we'll often see, 30, 40, 50 protest events that are reported per week, but sometimes reaching even 100 protests or more. So we really do have a very high level overall of contention and protests, again, even sort of outside of these sort of political eruptions. So here we have, this is one of the most important questions that we pose about each protest, which is to categorize the types of demands within this list of demands that you can kind of see written in the center of the graph. Here, the protest levels in the graphs are normalized, and what that means is that we can look at shifts in the proportions of protests that are expressing demands according to these different categories. So I'm going to work a little bit with this variable, these graphs in particular, and talk you through some of these trends that I think are important. The first one, I think, would be really the primacy of economic and social demands in both cases and throughout most of these time periods. So if we look at these two categories of labor and employment, as well as social policy and infrastructure, we can see that together those are making up about 80% of the protests that we're capturing in these databases. So I want to talk a little bit about, what does that look like? What are some of the kind of important subtypes of socioeconomic protests and their demands? Of course, and this has been, I think, mentioned by Rima and Michael, a very important one would be the nature of employment, unemployment, or informal employment. So in particular, we see a lot of contention in this period coming out of these groups called unemployed graduates, right? These are young people who have achieved a bachelor's degree or some other level of high education and are unable to find positions that are well suited to their level of education. This is kind of, one of those structural trends that economists from North Africa have been looking at for quite some time. And we see starting in the 1990s, actually in Morocco, organizations that are forming specifically to represent these unemployed graduates in the region, and they do a lot of protests. Other important subtypes, a lot of protests that are focused on kind of localized failures in infrastructure and services, things like the quality of roads, electricity, water deliverance. This is also in a context where, and this is particularly in this case in Tunisia, the state is undergoing during this transitional period a decentralization campaign, right? So the idea that, a lot of these functions of government would be devolved towards the municipal level. And at the same time that we actually see citizens protesting very often at the municipal level for, the upgrading or the fixing of infrastructure and services within their neighborhoods. Another kind of really popular topic within both countries would be extractive sector demands. So these are protests surrounding mineral sectors. We can include agriculture if we think of that as an extractive sector as well. These are export-oriented sectors, both in the sort of hydrocarbon and non-hydrocarbon spaces. So oil and natural gas, but also phosphates, silver. And within these spaces, we often see local communities who are organizing to demand a greater share of the revenues from these export sectors to be reinvested into their communities. So those are just a few of the kind of subtypes that we're looking at for social and economic demands. Another trend is looking at protests that are expressing demands for civic rights and freedoms. This is kind of here in this light orange color. We can actually see that this is a little bit coded per regime type, that Morocco and pre-2011 Tunisia have a higher proportion of demands surrounding civic rights and freedoms. Nonetheless, they remain important in post-revolutionary Tunisia in a number of ways, and often take up much of different forms. A lot of these will actually target the justice or judicial system, particularly protesting the arrests or detainments of different activists or militants or judicial procedures against figures who are aligned with opposition. Others will target press freedoms, the rights of journalists, which in many cases will actually intersect with demands surrounding judicial procedure, as in the recent case of Moroccan protests for the journalist Omar Radi. And then finally, we have a trend, and this is something that Rima and I have noted in our work in Iraq as well, which are protests surrounding a historical injustice against certain figures who have either been killed or injured in the course of either revolutionary events or wars, right? And so these are a group of people who will sort of mobilize for recognition and also for resources to be shared with these martyrs. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of bottom two categories, which are national political issues and local political issues, which we do separate as demands. So for national political issues, we can see this peaking in 2011 in both cases for obvious reasons. National political protests are in many cases what we think they are, right? So protests that are anti-regime, that are calling for the resignation of a leader, resignation of parliament, calling for elections, these kinds of things. Local political protests are those that are expressing similar demands, but with regards to local bureaucratic or political figures, right? Either at the regional level, the municipal level, or sometimes, down to a school principal who is unpopular in a particular town. And I want to take a moment to talk about these local political demands because in a sense, through some analysis of concessions and outcomes, we found that these local political demands are actually some of the most successful protests in both cases, right? So people are able to actually effectively use protest to get rid of local officials or party people or municipal people that are unpopular, even in a context where usually we don't think of citizens as having that kind of veto power over the appointed bureaucrats or representatives of the state. So one actually great example of this is something that happened in Tunisia in 2012. In the interior town of Siliana, people were mobilizing against their governor. The protests faced a lot of violence in their first few weeks. They escalated, and then you can see in this photo that people actually decided to walk out of the town on the main road, and they left and they kind of stayed on the road and demanded that their governor would be dismissed, and he was. So we have a lot of actually little cases like this of people successfully using these protests to kind of dislodge figures at the local level. Another common use of this would be in post-revolutionary Tunisia, people using protests to get rid of officials who had been part of Ben Ali's party, the RCD. And I think it actually speaks to, in some senses, the importance of understanding like the locality as an arena for protest rather than thinking of everything as kind of national. Let's see, I think I'm a little over time here. So again, this is organizations. Echoing Rima, we actually find a large percent of protests having no organizations affiliated. We see unions being one of the largest organizers of protests. And I can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if we would like. I can also talk a little bit more about tactics, which is something that we measure in Tunisia and Morocco as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and say thank you for listening. I think a couple limitations. Protest catalogs are broad in scale, low in detail. So a lot of times what we're doing is actually pairing these catalogs with qualitative studies of particular movements so that we can understand at different scales what is happening. And then there's also questions of how are these trends generalizable to other countries in North Africa and the MENA region. And that's something that I can speak to as well. So thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to contact me and I welcome your comments, feedback, questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Chantal, and thank you for guiding us through the different trends in Tunisia and Morocco. And the major thing that I found really interesting, and I think we should further study this, especially in the region, is the locality of the protests and the local political demands and how they were successful, why they were successful. This is something that I think we should be further also studied. I have one general question for our three panelists, and then we're going to take Q&A from the participants online. Okay, so we're discussing the protests, we're discussing the major trends, but what are the for me, like the major question that would come to my mind is, what are the outcomes of these protests beyond the questions of immediate success and failure on the short term, on the long term? How do you see these trends? How will they develop? Will they stop? And what are the major outcomes? Maybe we'll start Michael and then Rima, Chantal.
Well, thank you for these great presentations. I learned a lot, Chantal and Rima, from your own work. I think at this point, one of the things that we looked at is kind of who are the base protesters, and a time, kind of as Chantal was saying, between the major protests, what is the background of these people? And again, these may not be people who've shown up in a bunch of protests or weekly protests, versus those who've taken place or taken part in some type of action. So it is a kind of sense of who's likely to get this going. I do think that what we're seeing here is the question of what are the kind of specific grievances, and Chantal speaks a lot more to those type of issues than really we do. Certainly we're seeing this more broadly than I presented today, but the numbers across, or the percentages across the Middle East are just, I mean, devastating at this point. We are seeing just continuing decreases in economic outcomes, growing frustrations with certainly the regimes across the region, as we're asking people, they don't necessarily have a solution. And I think that that's a very dangerous place for the region. If we ask people what would improve the economy, there's complete differences, whether it be raising, just creating jobs generally, increasing subsidies, whether it just be there's not necessarily a sense or a vision. And I think that that's a really difficult place for the region to be, is that there isn't clearly something that people are moving on to say, this is what we want specifically, but it is a broad set of issues that is almost getting overwhelming. And we are seeing that in our last survey, in half the countries that we surveyed, at least a majority said that they had gone hungry in the past year. And this is really getting to be devastating levels across the country. So again, not that all protests are economic. Chantal and Rima have shown that there are a lot of different pieces here, but there are a lot of grievances. There are a lot of potential triggers. And I do think we see this kind of continual protest levels that we have shown people are engaged, even if people say no, that from the outside, these are not places that politics is happening because they're not democratic. People are outside of this. It is a place that people are engaged. It is people care, and there are the resources potentially and the potential losses for people to take to the streets. And so I do think that likely we are going to see another wave of uprisings, I think, that rise beyond kind of the normal, almost as, I forget the word Chantal said, but just kind of the regularized protest that happens just routinely at the local level, and potentially be something that is larger coming forward, because the broader percentage that we see is really devastating across the region.
I think I'm next. So yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, measuring outcomes is difficult because it depends what we mean. I mean, usually we tend to think of outcomes in terms of regime change, but we can also think of outcomes in terms of social outcomes, biographical outcomes. I did a lot of qualitative research and spoke to people, and people talk about how the Saura period was a period that changed their family dynamics, their marital relationships, their career choices. So these are huge historical events that have an impact on so many different levels, that we can, it has impacted gender relationships. It has impacted many things. Politically, I think we need to think of, so there are internal factors that can advance or hinder these movements, like organization, which remains one of the main issues that we're grappling with, the difficulty of organizing, the difficulty of finding time to organize, etc. And there are external issues, like how do you organize within an economic crisis of the scale we have in Lebanon, right? The effect of an explosion, like the Beirut port explosion, and the impact it had on, in terms of migration. A lot of, the activists have left the country, for example. So these are factors that play into, the outcomes. But in all cases, I think I agree with Michael that change is bound to happen. And when I say change, I'm not necessarily saying that it's good or bad. It will depend. But there are structural factors mainly related to, what we're all discussing here, right? Unemployment, underemployment, youth that have no opportunities, etc. And these are going to continue. I think what we can expect is a continued wave. And this is why I would think of this as a longer term process. And I know I give this example a lot, but when we talk about the French Revolution, we tend to forget that it was 80 years, right? And we think of it as a success. Revolutions are very deep social and political transformations that take many, many years. And there's always a counter-revolution, and there are always periods of ebbs and flows that will shape what the outcome will be. So I'm not trying to say that this will necessarily lead to the outcome of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or whatever other revolution, but these are long-term processes that have different mechanisms and different factors shaping them. And I think this is why it's important for us to study them while they're unfolding, and to understand what kind of changes they're bringing about, not just at the political level, although this is of course very important, but also at the social level.
Chantal, based on your findings, how do you see it, especially that you're working more like outside of the revolutions?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think a tricky one also. I definitely agree with Michael and Rima on, the need to think outside of, regime change or not regime change as our kind of outcome framework. So within this research, particularly that I showed, I'm interested in kind of how we think about the accumulation of small changes or the accumulation of small outcomes. So for example, within the protest database, we do actually track what we might call like immediate responses or concessions to the protests, right? So these are decisions that are like kind of stemming from the protest quite closely. And this can range, within the socioeconomic category from, relatively large victories, right? A change in minimum wage that's national to something that's very localized or small scale. So, the municipality agrees to come in and fix a road that's been flooding every time it rains, right? After people have protested about that. And so if this happens kind of over and over and over again in different localities, what do we make of that, right? Does that kind of amount to an effective welfare state? In an effective welfare state, you don't have to protest every time you want the state to fulfill the functions of the state. On the other hand, it's I think we don't want to dismiss these kinds of outcomes because they are, important to the people who are protesting for them, and because they kind of amount to a larger sense of a protest economy, right, where people are understanding that these kinds of changes can possibly be affected by protests, and they're thinking through, what are the tactics, what are the demands, like what do I see others doing who are successful, and how can I do that as well, right? So there's kind of an iterative dynamic with some of these smaller events. So yeah, that's I think, in some ways how I'm thinking about, categorizing these smaller changes. I also think that there's a sense in which, when people are not able to sort of use these familiar mechanisms to achieve changes that are necessary for their life, even if they are limited in scope, right, that's when we might sort of see escalation towards an anti-regime position. So I think thinking about the sort of connections and the flow between, anti-regime and economic demands, right, instead of thinking of them as separate categories, but rather as ways of framing issues pertaining to people's lives that are trying to be resolved in one way or another. So I think that there is a continuum there for us to understand as well.
Thank you. And actually, I have a follow-up question for Michael here. So Michael, we listened to Rima was talking more about similarities between Iraq and Lebanon, and then the difference between her findings and what the Arab Barometer is showing. And Chantal actually is working more on the localities. And this is something that I think would really be fascinating to know more about. How do you see it based on maybe your future research or the future trends that you will see or the future waves of the Arab Barometer? How would you frame them?
So it's certainly something that we can look at. I think others have looked at it. We've not necessarily looked at within the data itself exactly where the protesters are, and in part that's because of the way we sample, it's a bit hard to get that granular as Chantal would do, to say that if there's a protest in this province, we will pick up some of that I do think that what we are showing, and if we applied this to different waves, I think we'd see something relatively similar. And again, I think there is a big difference here with what Rima's doing, of looking at who's actually in the protests when there are large-scale protests, when this is taking place. These are people who maybe are coming on at a different point or not necessarily out there as routinely, but are joining for something larger because there's a greater frustration. So I think that that's one of the challenges of the barometer, and one of the things that we can't necessarily, typically it's a bit harder to do the types of survey work that we do when there are these protests. And in part, we finished in Algeria and the Iraq broke out. We had not quite finished field work, but we had to stop continuing just because of the challenges that were in place. And so we don't necessarily hit that same period. So I think it is something that really would in some ways fit better with Chantal. And I think, I don't know, Chantal, if you've actually tried to map some of these things onto some of our data or compared some of that yourself. I haven't actually done that with looking at the exact localities, things like that. But it is something that I do think there is a rich data set here. And it is certainly something that in between some of these mass protest events, we can think about who protested in the high points and who may be kind of more continually protesting. So there is a rich data source there. I only presented very little. I didn't go into that much detail given the number of countries we have and the way I presented it, but certainly we can break it down, and that would be, I think, quite interesting to do.
And actually, Rima, my question for you, how would you analyze the similarities between Iraq and Lebanon? In a way, like we saw the similarities, especially the waves and how the protesters are really working on the ground, and really the reply from the state. How do you see this? How would you analyze it?
Yeah, I think there are many similarities, but there are also major differences. So yeah, I don't want to fall in the trope of saying these two countries are the same, but there are, of course, similarities in the sense that these are two regimes that have identity-based consociational systems where, this is a very specific type of democracy. These are also regimes that have failed to deliver to their people. I mean, I would term it in the language of neoliberalism and kleptocracy and understanding, the failure of in Iraq, it was a rolling back of the welfare state. In Lebanon, it's a welfare state that has always been very weak or non-existent. So there are structural similarities. There are also differences, but I think the geopolitical setting of these two countries, between Iraq and between Iran and Saudi Arabia or the US on another side, and being, at this intersection, creates similar dynamics and, similar sectarian political parties that are at play, similar, and not that they're identical, but they can be comparable, which creates these, waves, I think, that are, of course, from below, but that take similar shapes, and where the demands are shaped in this language that is, and also if we see if we look at the transformation over time from 2011, where the demands were the downfall of the sectarian regime and, better services and socioeconomic demands. 2015, where it was a language of reform, and 2019, where it became very clearly about the overthrow of the regime. So we see this kind of intensification with time. I think in both countries, there's a challenge of organizing that is very important. And that is a major obstacle. And this is why, I talked about the barricades as a tactic, because I think it's an interesting finding that in countries where unions are very weak, we don't see, so it's at odds with what Chantal presented in Tunisia or Morocco, where we see unions being more prominent and more active. In Lebanon and Iraq, unions have been co-opted by these regimes. So people try to find other ways to impose a mass strike, and this is physically shutting down the country. There are other things that I didn't have time to show. I had prepared for a longer presentation, but interesting, actually, divergence between the two countries are the geographical spread, where in Lebanon we see the protest does not center in Lebanon until later on, basically end of January, February, in Beirut until later on. In Iraq, it starts in centered in Baghdad, and then it moves to the south. And of course, these have also sectarian connotations and other dynamics. So I think it's interesting to think of these two cases together. They do have some similarities. They definitely have differences, but they are interesting in thinking about them in this broader context of what we're seeing globally, a rise of revolutions in contexts that are supposedly democracies, or at least democracies with some type of regime that some call corrupt, other call kleptocrats, and I would call fiercely neoliberal. So I hope I answered your question.
And Chantal, actually talking about Tunisia and Morocco, in like 2 minutes, what have we learned from these protests based on your findings?
Oh my goodness, 2 minutes. Okay, so I think I actually wanted to echo some of what Michael had said about the ways in which different data kind of capture different characteristics of protest or different dimensions, right? So event data, as what I've shown you, is like not particularly good at capturing, demographic backgrounds of protesters, right? That's something that we do see much better through, surveys like the Arab Barometer. I think some of the things that really work well with protest event data are, in particular, this sort of geographic and temporal analysis, right? So the sort of like multiple dimensions and the ways in which we can sort of break down and disaggregate this data at the locality over time and have that kind of granularity in that sense. Again, I'll speak to this idea of concessions and outcomes, which is something that I've been really interested in, both sort of qualitatively through work I've done in the resource expert sectors and as well in the event data. So we actually do find pretty strong patterning in the ability of protesters to gain certain demands through different actions, one of which is the nature of affiliated organizations, right? So oftentimes, and this has actually particularly been the case in post-revolutionary Tunisia, right? Like people who are not affiliated to an organization or a union, right? And this is in the context of this real sort of explosion of associational activity in this period, are at a real disadvantage in terms of being able to access the state and present their demands. And so they're forming a lot of these alternative forms of leverage. And this also speaks to some of Rima's work on this idea of the barricade, right? So one of the slides that I didn't quite get to actually shows this like rapid increase in the use of what we call economically disruptive repertoires. So roadblocks, blocking the entrance to the municipality, shutting down a factory in post-revolutionary Tunisia. And this is a form of leverage that kind of works outside of those organizational or those kind of like corporatist channels, right? These are people who don't have access to this organizational infrastructure and are therefore basically kind of doing a shut it down kind of activity. We also find that the gains that they're able to make through these kinds of blockading activities are concrete but limited, right? So something in the range of 5 to 10 people to be hired at the municipality because they're jobless and that's why they're protesting, right? But that's limited in scope as compared with the kind of work that a union can do on behalf of the syndicate, for example. So I think there's a lot more work to do in thinking about, the scale of outcomes, particularly in the socioeconomic area, and different channels by which people with different means and different forms of access are actually able to achieve outcomes and how they're doing that.
Thank you, Chantal. Actually, we have one question. We're going to take it. So ethnographers are doing a lot of work nowadays on the afterlives of the uprisings. It's a trendy word in MESA, panel, and paper titles. What do your data say about cohort effects? What do we know about how different age groups in the region have experienced this period of mass protests and how it might have changed their views, preferences relative to other age cohorts?
All right, I will start with that if no one else wants to go, but please don't hesitate to jump in if you would rather. I can say I've not really looked at this with our own data. I've not really thought about this specifically in this line. I know that others, particularly Mark Tesler, has looked at this with some of the revolutionary groups that have taken place with particularly on things like gender attitudes or others, depending on the notes regime, and shown these cohort effects with survey data before. Even in our last report on gender, Mary Claire Roche, who's our director of technology at Arab Barometer, has shown something similar with views of women in a number of countries across Middle East, North Africa. So we can certainly see it in other places. I don't really know if that has extended to much of the protests. And I mean, in part, I think that would be a challenge of kind of operationalizing that with thinking through what are the protests that would matter most. And unfortunately, I only have survey data going back really routinely, at least for about 15 years now. So I think it'd be a bit more difficult to show, the effects that different groups had kind of in that same manner, given how the shifts would go. But I can say we have seen cohort effects elsewhere. I don't know of any that have been shown with the protests with the survey data that we have available.
Yeah. So I'm done. Yeah. So thank you very much, Michael, Rima, Chantal. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your work and your findings. And thank you for everyone who's attending online, and stay tuned for so many different also webinars and series of research and working groups. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, Tanya. Thanks, Rima. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks.
Thanks.